Start by apologizing, and I will apologizing for who I am. And in particular, I'm Olof Stenman, and I will in particular apologize for not being Thomas Sterner, who was supposed to be here and sharing this debate. Unfortunately, Thomas is ill, but he has now got some very strong medicine from the doctor, so we hope for a quick recovery. Anyway, of course, no one will be able to replace Thomas, but we will all do our very best in this regard. With this pessimistic start, I'm nevertheless very happy to be able to be presenting an outstanding panel that I would like to get up on stage here. So we start with an applaud for the panelists. So from the European Union, we have Delbeke, who just stepped down as the Director General for the GD Climate, and who is now a Senior Advisor on Climate Issues to the European Union President. We also have from China Professor Wang, who has a long and illustrious career at the World Bank in DC, but who is now back in China as the Dean for the School of Environmental and Natural Resources in Renmin. He's also the chairman of the Chinese Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. From India, and more specifically Indian Statistical Institute, we have Professor Somanathan, who is one of our most respected peers and researchers, educated in Harvard, a keynote at the last World Congress. He has led the IPCC for climate policy and so forth. And finally, we have, again, Gina McCarthy, and many of you, of course, heard her brilliant presentation yesterday on the, unfortunately, less exciting current attack or the stage of the world with respect to the state of science and the attack on science in the US, among other things. But nevertheless, given that, she was extremely encouraging and positive, and I think all of us got a lot of positive energy from that. So she was recently the head of EPA, of course, in the US, as I think you all know, and today she has many different roles, including being a researcher at Harvard University. So, as you can see, not only does this panel represent outstanding individuals in many dimensions, they also, through the background, somehow represent a large part of the world and an even larger part of the global economy, and also a very large part, actually, in that sense, of global climate emissions. They also represent both research and policy perspective, and I think that will be shown in what I think will be a very exciting debate. So the format will be about as follows. They will each get about 10 minutes for an introduction before the real debate starts, so to say. In the meantime, you all see the information behind me, right? And you can log on. You should log on slido.com, and then the number is, you don't need the square thing first, you just get the number J805, and then you could pose questions to the audience or to the panelists here, and we will, after the debate between these people in the panel, you will all have the possibility then. So then you could all both pose questions, and you could actually in quite advanced system, kind of, also vote for which questions that other people have posed that you think are exciting and you would like to see posed and so forth. So that would be exciting in itself, right? So don't miss that opportunity. So with that, I think we are ready to start. And then I will, the first member of this distinguished panel who will start is Delbeke. So please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to entertain you about what we have been doing in the European Union over the last couple of decades, in fact, when we started with climate policy. And Can you put it on? Okay. So we started with the Paris Agreement. No surprise, and I think the important achievement is that we got the emerging economies on board and that we have now a universal participation. And we really hope that the United States will join us later. That as a word of introduction, because it would be a shame if we would see this major player who was so productive in the delivery of the Paris Agreement staying outside. Now in the EU, we have been reducing our emissions significantly. In fact, what we are doing is setting targets per decade. We were setting on the basis of 1990 our target for 2020, and today we are beyond that, 20% that we were setting ourselves, and for 2030 we were setting a target of minus 40%. And that is now completely put into legislation. All policies and measures related to the delivery of that target has been shown. But most important is this one. This one shows the emissions in the EU per unit of GDP. And you see almost a straight line between 1990 and today. And that straight line is the green line on the bottom, where you see that per unit of GDP we have been halving almost the emissions. That means that GDP is up, emissions are down, and we succeeded through appropriate mix of production, technology, and other changes to bring down the emissions. Now we have plans to do that, but I would like to highlight to you 5 key measures that were very important to deliver that. And the first one is the emissions trading system. It is a system that covers half of the emissions of the EU, and it covers the emissions from all major industrial installations in the manufacturing industry as well as in power generation. And the important thing is that between 2005 and 2016, we have been able to reduce the emissions with 26%. So that's quite an important environmental result. But the controversy came on the low carbon prices that we have been seeing for too long time. The Lehman Brothers outfall was that we had prices around 5 euros instead of around the 15, 25 euros we had before. But we changed our legislation. And since we changed that a couple of months ago, you see in the last bit that prices have been doubling in a couple of months' time and will continue to rise as we expected. We have lots of allowances that are brought to the market through an auctioning platform, so it gives quite a number of revenues, and these revenues are partially redistributed to facilitate the restructuring process in the member states who are particularly carbon intensive, or what is the same, rely very much on coal and lignite, and that is a particular challenge. We also have measures in place to protect our industry from carbon leakage. So we give a quite significant amount of allocations of allowances for free through our manufacturing industry, in particular steel, cement, and basic chemicals. So the first and most important economic instrument that was done through a lot of implemented and applied research that you have been bringing collectively to the table was set into motion, was produced into legislation, and produced a quite significant outcome. The second measure is that for the other half of the emissions, the small emitters, the households, the buildings, the transport users, we have been distributing that according to our member states. And the targets, the binding targets, were distributed according to GDP per capita. And so the more wealthy ones have to reduce almost minus 40% compared to 1990. And the less wealthy ones can stabilize their emissions because, after all, in total amounts, their emissions are less important. But the second most important measure that brought down the emissions of the Europeans significantly has been the steep rise in renewable energy. We doubled over the last decade the share of renewables, and it's going to increase, and that is not yet on the graph, to 32% set by law in 2030. That means that by 2030, more than half of the electricity produced in the EU will be through renewable sources. And how have we been able to do that? Of course, in the beginning, the marginal costs of abatements were very high. But the more we installed renewables, the lower the costs came. And you know that the cost reductions continue to take place, and that's why we are confident that we are even going to overshoot the target of 32% by 2030. So that is also what is in the NDCs translated in Paris, but that is a less of an important issue that I would like to highlight to you. We could only bring back the changes in the power sector through a flexible European electricity market. And that market is not yet entirely open and entirely flexible. But having the flexibility to insert the renewables into the market is a very important issue. So a flexible European electricity market is still on the table of our politicians for making it open for the next phase. But I think that is a quid pro quo to make the changes happen on the renewables. And finally, on energy efficiency, I think the appliances we are using, the cars we are producing, are steadily reducing the energy and hence the emissions they are using. So what are we doing in Europe? In fact, the energy mix is changing radically. You see that the blue bar, the part of renewables, is radically increasing, while the part of the coal and solids is reducing very fast. And the real debate that is now lingering in Europe is on the middle two bars. That is, either are we going to provide our energy mix mainly through gas or through nuclear, heated political debate that's going to be sorted out in the immediate future. What I wanted to show you is that policy can work. And policy works provided it is well prepared. And there is no quick fix. You have to make gradual and steadily the changes and continue. There is no quick fix, but over time, over the last 15 years where we had a meaningful climate policy, we were able to bring down the emissions as of now with 23%, and we will continue to do so. Thank you very much.
Next, Professor Wang, please. Could we get the correct slides on? So we'll do it ourselves then. No, this is faster. Thank you.
No, you were under. You did very well.
No, the other one. That one, wonderful. Yes, just doing a trick. Wonderful. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm excited and also, of course, feel kind of honored to join this panel. As many of you know me, if you know me before, I'm not a typical climate person. I really feel kind of challenged to be the panel here. This is a distinguished panel here. But as I guess most of you know, I'm an economist. I work in the World Bank for 20 years. Now I'm also in China. I work in China for 6 years, and 4 years in the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Now 2 years in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and Renmin University, China, and teaching environment economics and policy. As you can see that, of course, I have a lot to say about this climate business, right? But I'm only allowed to speak like at the beginning only 10 minutes, but I have like 60-something slides here. You can see that I want to say a lot of stuff, right? But it's a challenge how to finish this in this 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Of course, I was suggested to speak something about the challenges of the current climate governance, especially the weak governance of the climate change. And also I ask to speak something about this governance, also about economics, and also especially because I'm a Chinese, and people, I guess most of you also expect me to speak about China. So I finally decided I focus on just some key messages. And first, just the key challenges. And then about this governance, I will say something about how to strengthen the current governance. And I have 2 programs I feel proud of myself. I will present it to you. About economics, I will say something about the research related to this climate change, especially about this people's value and challenges. I review that. Now also, especially I give some questions to you people, because you are famous economists, as most of you actually much more famous than me. Especially I have my advisor here. I feel really, only raise questions. And then finally, in the China practice part, I will only give one example there. So at the beginning, let me start. I will move very, very fast. I'm speaking Chinglish, but please bear with me. I will move very fast, okay? Very fast. But later, if you have questions, I can answer. Because I only have 10 minutes. Now I have speak like 2 minutes, still have 8 minutes left. Challenges. I would like to thank my colleague Wang, and also our team, several professors, did analysis, did simulations of this 2 degree and 1.5 degree goal. Then they calculated the total amount of emission allowed for 2 degree and 1.5 degree. You can see that the bar for red is 2 degree and 2 degrees, and the blue ones are 1.5 degrees. And but the total emission in the year of 2017 is in the global is 32 GT. But for the 2 degree, only allow for 1,000. That means just only about like 30 years, and we'll reach 2 degrees. And for this 1.5 degree, it's total like 15 years, just like 15 years. So really serious. And here summarized what's the requirements. Some more ambitious NDC targets, and also need to get this global carbon emission peak come earlier and lower, and especially need a kind of negative emissions. That's it's necessary for this 1.5 degree. So generally, it's necessary to establish a kind of innovative global climate governance system. In terms of global climate governance, I think you should have some general background, general framework. I will move quickly about this general background part, and then move quickly to the to my suggestions. This is a general picture. I guess you know that it's a governance system combines government side and also economic side, market side. And I would like here to emphasize the social and the society side. Understanding the nature of global governance, let's move quickly. The global climate governance as part of global governance. Now this strategy with this Paris agreement is kind of bottom-up strategy. I think you can see this. I speak as too slow. Someone smiling. Is it Trump? It's Trump. Mr. Trump's structure. I just quickly go through this background stuff. And it's climate governance system also also have these interactions with other mechanisms, and also more important rules of non-state actors. Actually, these 2 aspects of the nature of this global governance system I would like to emphasize. And I have this general comments and suggestions on current global climate governance. I guess you may feel strange. I said it's cautiously optimistic. And I think I don't have time really to explain that. Generally just kind of, I think this awareness, people now aware of this, and also technology. I am really confident in this technology part. And how to improve this governance? Of course, we need to continue work on this governmental side, to try to strengthen this governance system. But I think two dimensions we should extend our focus. One is more actions on lower levels of government, the cities, communities, NGOs, and the business. And the second dimension is to take use of other areas of governance, such as energy and local pollution. Nobody remind me time, huh? Quickly, 3 observations in China. And the first one is the performance rating and the disclosure. This is kind of effective tool with low cost. I think people, if you know the work, our work in the World Bank, you know this. And this approach is very effective and applied implemented in several countries. And in Ghana, in Philippines, Indonesia, China, and the performance of the firms related to colors, 5 colors, like green, blue, yellow, red, black. Now China, actually, all provinces are adopting this strategy. Now, these ratings, the results, submit to the public. Of course, we expect the markets and the societies to generate an impact on this. And globally, I found that when I look at the literature, and there are some efforts to evaluate the performance of the countries. But I suggest that to use this strategy, to apply this strategy, not only to the countries, but also to the cities, also to these companies, widely use this approach. The second one is the stakeholder dialogue approach. I have no time to explain this, but you can see that it's including government, business, and citizens, and different levels. I initiated this program in China, that's 18 years ago, and it turns out very, very useful, especially when there are conflicts caused by environment, also not just the environment issues, also other issues. And there are various formats developed in China, and functions not just share information and promote mutual understanding, but same time identify the problems, solve disputes, and generate agreement and joint decisions. But China, but when I say this, India have lost such kind of program. I don't know whether or not it's effective. In China, it's very effective. I have a book will be out actually in a couple of weeks. Topics including the air and water. Of course, here we talk about the climate change. We can focus on climate change. Provide trainings. I'm going to show you some pictures. The dialogue, this agreement reached. You see the media involved. Newspaper report. The second recommendation is using stakeholder dialogue strategy for different levels of climate governance. The third one is kind of this is based upon our Chinese experience. That's also my understanding. It's good energy and local pollution control policies can generate significant positive climate impacts. as you know, the China's NDC target is to reach the peak climate dioxide emissions by 2030. And when you calculate that, you can find that all this can have significant impact on this local pollution, SO2, NOx, and PM2.5. And our colleagues did analysis, and I'm sorry, okay. Did analysis on this, just the reduction of the carbon dioxide emission mostly caused by this energy effort. The significant reduction of carbon emission in the past came from the energy saving and the pollution reduction system. And also, this peak emission of carbon dioxide may come earlier than expected due to this program. This is the sole recommendation: take advantages of good governance of other related areas such as energy and local pollution. I guess I run it out of time. It's economics. I just say something very, very short. I read the report, especially I guess most of you read this report by published by National Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine. And you can see the difficulties, the uncertainties involved, the social cost, carbon, it's an estimate. I suggest actually this one should be conducted in all these different countries, and especially in the local area. But the work is very, very difficult, and people's opinion different, people's value different, and especially recently I published one book, one paper that's people's discount rate. There's a dramatic difference. But usually we assume like 2%, 3%, but in China I estimate for sometimes even like 100%, 300%. So it's I stop. Yes, it's the last one, I guess. I'm sorry, practice in China. You ask me questions about China later on, then I will have time to answer your questions. This economics, okay. I should just stop. I just show you something then quickly. Now you can see this, right? This is a summary. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Now we have exciting perspectives from both European Union and China. So now our next speaker is Professor Somanathan, who will give us a little bit a flavor of the Indian perspective, I guess, or maybe global or whatever, but nevertheless, the floor is yours. So we'll get the new slides. So.
Thank you very much, Olof. And it's a great honor and a pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel. I kind of regret titling this Climate Policy in Indian Perspective. It's true that I'm Indian and my perspective is shaped by the fact that I'm Indian, but it's not representative of anybody except myself. So let me, first I have a lot of opinions, which I think, and I hope you will find somewhat provocative. But before I get to the opinions, let me give you some facts and some results. So this is data from a paper with my co-author Shoibal Chakravarti, who's sitting over there, that will be presented in more detail later in this conference. And what it is showing you is on the horizontal axis, that's cumulative capacity in coal in India in gigawatts. Those straight lines are the current costs of wind and solar power in India as revealed by auctions in the government program. That's costs are in rupees per kilowatt hour on the vertical axis. And those curves there, they tell you what the costs are of coal-fired generation, right? Ordered from cheapest to most expensive from left to right by capacity. The dotted lines are private costs, and the solid lines, we have added our estimate of only domestic external costs, which are dominated by air pollution mortality. Okay? So if you look at the bottommost line, that's the operating cost of coal in May 2018. And as you can see, some of those plants, quite a good, not insignificant part of the capacity is more expensive. Actually, there's more capacity, but it doesn't appear in the data for May because it wasn't available, actually. It wasn't running. So that would be presumably more expensive still. So as you can see, the costs of renewables in India have dropped dramatically over the last several years. And as a result now, there are many gigawatts of coal capacity in India which are now more expensive just to run than the renewables. Now, if you look at the next dotted line up, that's total cost after you add capital costs. And as you can see, therefore, now it's basically uneconomical to build new coal plants in India because renewables are so much cheaper. And at the moment, they're a very small fraction of generation. So the issues of the fact that they are variable and unreliable is not yet an issue. And then when you add the domestic pollution externalities, you can see that once you include that, then the operating costs are higher than renewables for basically all of India's capacity. And these are quite conservative estimates of externalities. They leave out quite a bit, which we couldn't measure. Right? And the highest line up there is when you add the capital costs as well as the domestic externalities. So what you can see is that we have reached a situation in India where coal is already in trouble. So this is a headline from the Economic Times, which is one of India's biggest business papers. NTPC is the National Thermal Power Corporation. It is the biggest coal generator in India. It's a federally owned company. And what NTPC is doing now is it's trying to replace some of its more expensive coal generation with renewables. Okay? So this process has begun. So what does this imply? It's the fact that solar PV and wind are now the cheapest sources of electricity. That's going to drive the decarbonization of the electricity sector in India, which hasn't yet begun, but because of the cost numbers that we see and the fact that there's no reason to believe that the solar and wind prices will not continue to fall, we can expect more of this, right? So what I want to just talk about next is how did we get here and what lessons can we learn? So I'll pretend that you are taking a 101 class, okay? So I'm going to keep this very simple. So basically, how did we get to where we are? We basically first have natural scientists warning us that there's big trouble coming from climate change. Then we have environmental groups making a noise about it. We have a fossil fuel industry that responds by clouding the waters. And I want to show you a video here. That's an octopus. And so what they do when they are threatened is they squirt a cloud of ink, right? So that's what the fossil fuel industry has learned to do. They're very smart. Now, the general public is mildly pro-green, but not paying much attention. They have other things to do than think deeply about environment and economics. And because the general public is that way, governments, by and large, respond with mild policies that are mostly designed to show they're doing something. But at the same time, they have to be careful not to offend fossil fuel owners who have deep pockets. And they divert attention by scolding China and India. Okay, and economists like us, we mutter about carbon pricing, and for the most part, sometimes somebody listens, but mostly we are ignored. Okay, So now here's what I think is an important development. So lots of policies, right? So there have been lots of policies. You've heard about them. There's kind of a policy kitchen sink. Lots of ideas are tried. In the middle of all this somewhere, about 15, 20 years ago, I guess, Germany and Spain started subsidizing the deployment of very expensive solar PV. Right? And they're scolded by some economists for adopting a high-cost policy, which it was. This deployment, however, did spark manufacturing in China, which drives down costs through learning by doing and economies of scale. And that's how we got to those cost curves in India that I showed you before that. Okay? Now let's turn to the same thing for middle and low-income countries. The politics are somewhat different because the general public has more pressing problems, by and large. So climate change is mostly ignored. People have lots of people are struggling economically, and there's lots of local pollution issues which are more obvious, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically, politicians face no demands to do anything about climate change domestically, by and large. So then the issue of climate change is first raised, actually, externally, not through domestic politics. And so it's natural for governments of these countries to react by pointing out that it's all rich countries' fault, right? Which is more or less true. And then the rational response is, well, better get rich as soon as possible so that we can protect ourselves from the storm when it comes, right? And also roll out some policies to make it look like we're doing something, okay? So let me turn to India in particular. In 2007, the Prime Minister went to one of many G20 meetings and happened to get an earful from some of the other leaders there about Indian obstructionism on climate, right? Because, as I said, the Indian position was more or less what I described to you just now. So then the PM came home and told his technocrats, produce a climate plan, right? So within a year, they came up with a national action plan on climate change, which had 8 national missions, right? And 7 of these didn't do very much. I mean, they did something, some of them. But the national solar mission turned out to be a roaring success, right? By 2018, it had basically brought costs down to the level that you've seen, which are not the lowest in the world, but pretty close, despite the relatively high cost of capital in India. Okay, and to go back to what I was saying before, this was probably made possible by the early German and Spanish deployments, and also some other countries, but the biggest ones were Germany and Spain. Basically move that technology down the learning curve. So what can we learn about this, from this? By and large, the general public in most countries, with a few exceptions, is not yet in a panic about climate change. It'll take more and bigger hurricanes, fires, and heat waves for them to get there, right? But we're not there yet. Fossil fuel owners still have deep pockets, and therefore governments really cannot do very much. Okay, they can do something, but because there's pressure from both sides, but they can't do very much. So the Paris Agreement, I think, to oversimplify somewhat, is, in my view, basically an agreement to pursue business as usual with a few green bells and whistles. And there are a few exceptions. Some countries have quite strong domestic constituencies, and they have stronger policies. And some countries basically don't, as we know. With regard to carbon pricing, which all of us think is very important, in most cases, there's only token carbon pricing or no carbon pricing at all. In a few cases, there are very high taxes, like Sweden, on a more or less narrow segment of industry, and these are typically countries with no large incumbents that will resist. Okay? So the question is, what is feasible now? And I think that really the most important thing that can be done, and that is politically perhaps feasible, is policies to induce technical progress, especially early stage R&D, because these are less threatening to incumbents, and they're less threatening to incumbents precisely because it's early stage, so the effects will be seen after a delay. So whoever is might feel threatened that their income is under attack, doesn't feel very much pressure because it's not going to be, the effects of this are not going to be seen for a while, and by then they'll probably be gone anyway. So what kind of technologies? Technologies for advanced biofuels, hydrogen, carbon dioxide removal, albedo enhancement, all kinds of other geoengineering. I think we need R&D support for all of these things because, as we saw earlier, the Paris Agreement has not produced stated goals that are going to get us anywhere near bringing us back to a degree of safety in the next few decades. So we're going to need lots of new technologies that can do much more than what can be done now. We also need deployment support for technologies that have matured somewhat. So we already have, as we saw, we had this deployment support for PV and wind. We need this deployment support for technologies that are now getting to where PV and wind were a few years ago. And I'm thinking particularly of concentrated solar power with storage, battery storage, electric cars, stuff like this. But of course, it's harder to do deployment support because the effects are more immediate. You're going to immediately start driving fossil fuel prices down if those things are deployed in any significant way. But still, that, I think, is really something that has to be done. The story of solar PV really needs to be repeated for technologies like these. We don't know which ones will succeed, so at this point, they should all be supported. So as I just said, as deployment of renewables displaces fossil fuels, as is happening in coal and will happen with electric cars, prices will fall, okay? And by and large, economists have seen this as a downside, so there's a lot of literature, as we know, about leakage. One country does something, and then prices fall, et cetera. But it also has an upside, which is that if prices fall far enough, then rents in the oil and gas industries will be wiped out, right? And the political resistance from them will be greatly weakened, and that's going to allow, basically, the feasible set of policies to expand much more than what we have today. So I think that that's the direction that we should be thinking of. So what lessons do I draw for us economists? I think we should pay more attention to the long-term global effects of any climate policy. Because short-term evaluations, is this policy cost-effective, et cetera, that's fine. We should do those things, but we shouldn't overinterpret them, and we shouldn't overgeneralize about them. The other thing that's really important, and I think that's already been mentioned, is to pay more attention to domestic externalities that are climate-related. And because there's simply more public awareness and more support for actions on this front, the Chinese and Indian climate policies are partly driven by these externalities. And this is true for most countries, including developed countries. So I think that's most important. Okay, thank you.
So thanks a lot, Tom. And now, finally, Gina McCarthy. So we are happy to have you here again.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. It's great to be able to spend a few more minutes with you. For those of you who heard me last night, good for you. For those of you who are absent, I have no intention of repeating myself. That's what my teachers always used to say to me. I've never been able to say it to anybody, so this is fun. But I also don't have any graphs. Isn't that shocking at an economic conference? But I'm not an economist, so I don't need graphs. The only slide I ever use is one that just says, "Don't worry, be happy," and that's not particularly effective at times. So it's great to be here, but I am going to, say a few things that were a little bit different than before. And the way I wanted to do it is to just, in my own style, talk a little bit about what I've been doing since the Obama administration, because it'll give you a sense of what I think is important and what I can do as an individual. And that, I hope, will provide some framing for the panel discussion. Because I had to figure out what was next for me. I had spent 35 years in government, so I had to think long and hard about what to do next, at least I did for a couple of days, and my choices were really, what do I do to continue to make a difference? Because it's really hard to go from a position working for President Obama where you're really free to think about how to make systemic change. And I knew I wanted to just keep learning, keep exploring, and frankly, just keep making a difference. I apologize, I was brought up in the 60s. It's sort of what we do. And so for me, I wanted to look at how we make systemic change. And I wanted to look at how you can do things beyond government to actually shift markets, to really make systems change. And so I did 3 things. One is, for the first time in my life, I went to work for a private company. I will say it's not, it's not earth-shattering. It's a small little private equity company called Pegasus. And it's in New York City, and it just invests in sustainability and wellness, mainly because I don't know absolutely anything about the business world, and I thought it might be a good opportunity. They're a great company. They really heavily invest in ESG. They're really cool, so it's been a great opportunity. I also do a lot of speeches, and where I give speeches is mainly at colleges, because young people are flipping out in the United States of America. They don't understand what's going on in Washington, and many of them only saw the Obama administration. And I try to tell them, guess what? The Obama administration was a little unique. We actually got a lot done. And so prior to the Obama administration, there was virtually not one single passage of real legislation or real policy invested in climate change. So don't go worrying yourself to death that all of a sudden there's no ability to make any change, because it's not true. And the third thing I wanted to do was focus on climate change. And the way that I'm doing that is I have a new center at Harvard called the Sea Change. It's the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment. And it is at the Harvard School of Public Health. And I am there because I am not an environmentalist. I am a public health advocate. That's what EPA is. It's not the Birds and Bunnies Agency. We measure ourselves by how we address what economists call these externalities, which is, for me, is human lives and health. And I want to look at climate through a public health lens, because in my world, the only thing that ever mattered was what I made personal to you about your own children and your own family. Then you would think about supporting something. And until we ground climate to make it relevant to every human being and think about the systems that we can get people behind to broaden the engagement, even of the solutions that we have available today, and find the financial strategies that can drive those into the market and make change, then we are simply going to be taking too long to make incremental progress. And so it's been really fun to think about what is happening. And my first message to you is, having thought about this a lot, is I want to make it very clear in the international context that no matter what happens in Washington, D.C., the United States of America is still in. We are working hard. We are not divesting ourselves. We, in fact, are standing up tall, both with cities and with states, as well as the business sector. And you look at those rollbacks, we covered this last night, stop worrying about them. We did them right, they're not, end of the story. Okay? And the clean energy train in the United States of America is just like what I'm hearing in India, maybe a little bit further along, but we are moving forward. Yes, we're not making the progress that we would want, but progress never comes little steady. It comes in leaps and bounds. And the US carbon emissions have gone down even last year under this administration, because guess what? We are actually divesting in coal because renewable energy is cheaper, it's more effective, and even the utility companies will not change their investment strategy just because the Clean Power Plan is stuck in the courts. They are doing exactly what we would want them to do. And as a result of that, jobs have followed. You see jobs leaving the coal industry, and you see twice as many jobs in a growing renewable energy market in the United States. And that's the fastest growing market in terms of job growth that we have. Clean energy is the future, baby, and that ain't changing because this administration wants to go back to the future. We are going to keep pushing forward. Now, that's my first message. Now, my second message is that this trend actually won't be stopping, even though it's incredibly irritating to live in the United States of America right now. But we are actually looking at cities and states filling the gap of the federal government. Now, many of you may say, oh, well, cities and states can only do so much. But as I just explained to you, the federal government didn't get into action until the Obama administration on climate. And the only reason they could do it, I could do it, or anybody in the administration could do it, is because cities and states were working their tails off for the past 10 or 20 years. So they weren't an open slate where they had brilliant ideas and economists came in, like Michael Greenstone, who really was a big pain in the neck. So I'm glad he got an award. He deserves it because he put up with the likes of me when he was in the White House. But what we find today is that states are continuing to innovate. Before the federal government took action, we had California moving forward. We had the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative moving forward. We tested the waters at local level, at state level, because in the United States of America, no innovation starts at the federal level. It gets pushed up. Because if you're dealing with pollution, pollution trickles down to the most vulnerable communities, and when they get activated, the solutions trickle up. That's how it works. So please don't be disappointed or think we're going to be standing still. It is not happening. And America's pledge is 20 states plus Puerto Rico. That is half of the nation's economy. 250 plus cities are engaged and committed. Over 1,400 businesses that represent $25 trillion in market capitalization is in the game. And we are really moving forward as best we can to meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. We have Reggie that's continuing to get tighter and expand. California is, as California always does, going nuts, which I love. And we got Washington and Massachusetts both looking at opportunities to actually do what you economists like, which is put a carbon tax or a price on carbon directly. We've got many things going on with other states in terms of setting renewable fuel standards and with looking at opportunities for energy efficiency. So we are moving in it, and it's in the game now. And we are happy to see that that's happening because it is the economy stupid. So that is working well. Now, the other thing that we're doing, other than the US being still in, and shifting towards a clean energy economy, is to think about changing the discussion from the costs of climate change. At least this is what I'm trying to do, and I'm up for convincing you of this. We have to stop talking about the cost of climate change and talk about investments. Because if you think about this, we have tried to scare the bejesus, which is a technical term, out of people by telling them how horrible a future with climate change is. Can we just simply say that a future where we invest in ourselves and in our health and in our communities is where we want to be, and it is exactly the same investments that you would have as a result of investing in getting rid of climate change. Now you look at what happened in China. I was in Beijing. That was my monitor on the embassy in Beijing that showed that you had significant air quality problems. That's what drove them to think about combining air quality with climate change. It was a smart move and they knew it, and now they're flying at a pace that the United States no longer can keep up with because our federal government has divested. And when you look at what's happening in India today, I was just reading about 200,000 people whose lives are at risk because of significant drought in India. Let's talk about those people. Let's talk about the fact that you have significant air quality problems, which everybody knows, and those air quality problems are pointing to coal burning, and they're pointing to these primitive cook stoves. We know how to fix that. We don't have to rely on climate change arguments in order to get that to happen. So I'm enjoying myself trying to figure out what's going on in the business world and how to continue to make a difference. I can see folks like Ralph Fink at BlackRock, who represents trillions of dollars, saying, you either invest with the purpose, or I'm not going to invest in you anymore. Those are systemic changes. Those are challenges to how the business community can work. And I want to be part of that effort to have businesses standing up, not shooting like an octopus with ink, but recognizing that their ocean is deteriorating. They better get moving, because it's a business threat. And I'm talking to students who are the coolest things. So at Sea Change, I'm talking about kids and climate. I'm talking about how to make children's lives better, what it matters to each and every family, because until we communicate the science, until we communicate why we need to invest in a different path forward, then we will not be able to broaden the engagement and make significant progress happen on climate change. And I'm talking about not just communication, but I'm talking about working with cities and states so I can give them information on health benefits associated with the actions they're taking. So they can go to their community and say, I'm not just making a commitment to climate, but you want me to do this because it's better for you. This is what it means. How can we drive those changes? And internationally, we really need to focus on how we support other countries who are facing significant challenges. 9 million people die every year in this country because of exposure to pollutants. 7 million of them are exposed to significant air quality challenges. We have to address the future, not just a low-carbon future. That's just where we have to head. So in closing, I just want to say that it's going to be up to you, economists, to help us make that shift from cost to investments, to help us make the argument and to help us design the strategies just like you have done before, to help us find the path forward, to change the dialogue. And I appreciate your interest in carbon price, but I will tell you that I am going to grasp at any step forward because that's what it's going to take. Not everybody's ready. Not everybody's tested it. We have to allow, as we've done before, an opportunity to move forward at every level using every tool available to us. If you share my goal that what we really want to do is not correct the horrendous problem of climate change, but it's about making the world a cleaner, healthier, safer, and more sustainable place for everyone, then let's keep that lofty goal in mind. Let's articulate it, because right now I saw a sign at the Science March and it said, "Science needs heroes." I really need you guys to be those heroes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gina, and all of you for exciting talks. Time flies when you're having a good time, so we will try to mix in some questions that you have posed during the way. I will start with the very broad question that I think you have all touched upon before we go to those. Taking the global perspective, I think the current picture that you have given us varies. Some are very optimistic one with respect to solar power and technological development, although there are also negative technological development in respect of fracking and so forth, of course. But and there are emission reduction in some areas of the world, less so in other parts of the world. And we at the global level, it doesn't. The emissions are not as close to reducing as much as we think they should do, and the scientists say they should do. Right? So it's a little bit discouraging in that sense. The Paris Agreement is encouraging in the sense that the whole world agreed on something which was good, although the content, as you put some, is of course less encouraging in that sense. So the broad question then is, how do we fill the Paris Agreement with content, or is that really the wrong question even? You have touched upon that somehow in one way or another, all of you in some sense. Is it possible to give brief views on that? Is that the right way to think about the problem, how to make that fly in reality, or should we primarily focus on other issues in order to reduce global emissions? Who would like to start? as brief as possible in order to have time for as many questions as possible.
I will be very brief. I think that the most important is to get started. And that is where the Paris Agreement is a start. As the Kyoto Protocol was a start for the EU to take things forward and to start implementing policies. Because policies are not made in one go, by one technology, by one policy. You know, it has to be a policy environment where you have to get started, and then let's see what is emerging as one of the potential solutions to the problem. As we have all been underlining, renewables is one of the solutions for the future. And others are on their way of making it. But you cannot predict them, so you need an environment where you get started. And the Paris Agreement, in that respect, is a start with the whole world on board, including the emerging economies. And I think that we worked very hard together, all of us, I think, to make that happen in Paris, and thanks to the Obama administration, where we did a great thing to make it happen and get it ratified just on the right moment. So I think get started, it would be my reaction, and let's then perfectionize, you know, the thing en cours de route.
Anyone else who would like to add anything to that? Or disagree or agree? Or?
No, I agree completely. I think that that it's true that the Paris Agreement by itself is inadequate. It's not going to get us there, and we need a stronger agreement. But I completely agree. We have to start somewhere. So, and as I said, any little thing that can get something rolling could end up with big consequences. Like as I mentioned the story about the Indian Prime Minister going to the G20 meeting in 2007. I mean, that set something rolling, and now 10 years later we have really significant change that has occurred as a result. Yeah.
So if I interpret you correctly, you say that it might contribute to in a good development, although that would not solve it in a sense. You need parallel strategies in a sense, right? Is that one way of thinking of it, or is it just that this is the major hope we have?
No, I think that yes, we're quite constrained politically, right? I mean, we can sit here and talk about optimal policies for a very long time, but the fact of the matter is that the set of policies that can actually be implemented in the politics of the world today is quite restricted. So we should be very happy to implement whatever we can that helps to solve the problem, and we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Yeah.
Okay. So we move to the questions here. So these are the most popular ones somehow. So we start with the most popular one here by Gernot Wagner. We have here China, European Union, India, and the US in the table in a sense, which is the most important jurisdiction that are not represented on stage, and why? I mean, I'm not sure who that question is good to in a sense, but nevertheless, we would like to explore that in a sense. So obviously there are many missings, both geographically but also in other dimensions, I guess.
Well, I guess, yeah, well, fossil fuel exporters, I think, are missing. So, well, that's a perspective that's important.
I think it's pretty clear that Africa is not represented.
That's another question somehow. It's not the top question right now, but it was here for some time. Why is Africa missing in?
And if I can add the middle-sized emerging economies, type Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, the Philippines. Let's not overly concentrate on the big players that are here, but also on these very important emitters who also have technologies and resources they can contribute to the world.
Another question here. Do you think CO2 emissions should be based on consumption rather than production then? Thus include, for example, the emissions that induced by consumption of Swedes that are produced in China, for example. And that's a perspective that is sometimes put forward. What do you think of that? Not sort of generally what you think is good or bad, but in the process of solving the climate process somehow. Or fairness perspective?
I think it's addressed to me, because my statistic was based on a production-based approach. That was the approach of the United Nations, of the Kyoto Protocol, and was reconfirmed under the Paris Agreement. So I'm more than open to discuss other approaches, but we agreed that, we reconfirmed that, and if every country is approaching its direct emissions, then the problem is going to be sorted out. This is part of the logic of a bottom-up system where every country has a responsibility within its own jurisdiction. And I think that's the principle of the Paris Agreement that was wished by all parties who signed up and ratified it. I know that's a legalistic answer, but consumption has a potential to intrude into consumption-based policies, to intrude into the policies of other countries. We did it once in the EU, where we were including aviation emissions into the ETS. We got the whole world over us, because they said you can only regulate emissions over the European territory, not over the high seas and not over my or the other country, while we regulated incoming and outgoing flights, for the whole stretch of the flight. It was a very heated debate, I can tell you, and our enthusiasm in Europe to go for a consumption-based approach has gone relatively low.
And related to the legal perspective is, of course, the measurability problem per se. That would be, I guess, at least I would take it like that. Okay, so then we have a more specific question to Gina, actually, here. If US wishes to rejoin the Paris Accord in a few years, will it be on track or close to meet its original commitment given existing states' efforts?
Well, let me make one thing clear, is that we are still in the Paris Agreement, and we cannot even get out of it until 2 days after the next presidential election. So keep your fingers crossed. If you haven't registered to vote, which is what I tell every student I talk to, register. Make your interests and your values known. But will we be on track? I'm not sure any country will be on track to make commitments. But I will tell you that what the percentage of the economy that has made commitments is very large. We will certainly not be able to make up for the entire breadth of the United States, but I think the best we can do in the current system is to try to move as fast as we can with those that are committed.
Right. Okay. In between here, we have a number of very good questions still going on. Still, if you would challenge each other with respect to the main strategy, do you disagree with something important that each of you said that with respect to what is needed to be done and what the focus should be on, etc., without looking at that side? Or are you mostly in agreement with what you said, just as you gave different perspectives?
I'm confident that for the EU that we are going to deliver our objectives, because there is one thing, and that is where I'm worried about the Paris Agreement, is that we all submitted an official plan.
Right.
But very few countries, are translating that plan into policies and measures. That is worrying me. There is a lot of grassroots reaction, as Gina was saying, the cities and the companies, etc. But after all, policies needs to be shaped up and it needs to be framed. And that frame is falling short. I think that, in all honesty, China and the EU are doing a major effort to implement their plans and translate them into policies. But I see a lot of major players, in particular middle-sized emerging economies, part of the G20, who are sitting on their hands and wait for the others. And I would be relatively worried for the delivery of the plans, the objectives that they announced under Paris, because we all know making policies has a time lag. Before you have an agreement on your policies, you are years away before they are implemented and delivering the emission reductions. It's a hell of a job to be done.
In order to nudge you a little bit of potential disagreement, maybe, I'm not sure whether it will work or not, the fairness perspective in a sense, right? Also taking into account the fact that Africa is not represented by the table in a sense, and of course there are huge differences both in emissions and in terms of GDP per capita and so forth. How do you view these problems, or do you think we somehow just go on as good as we can? Or is there anything, should we think differently about those problems? Should we try to address them systematically in a different way that we do currently? Is there a role for that? And now I know that the political climate is not very encouraging in many dimensions, but nevertheless, how do you view these things? Is it possible to give a clear answer to that? Gina?
Can I just make the point that in my experience in international agreements, it's not unusual to have flexibility built into the system where you set goals and you allow individual countries to achieve those and to test the waters on how to get there. I think one of the biggest values of the Paris Agreement is clearly the transparency. You know, because part of what I'm trying to articulate is the need to get individual grassroots organizations to hold their own countries accountable. That's the only way that I know we can really make firm progress, and that transparency is huge, as well as the opportunity and the requirement to have a capacity building fund that helps emerging governments and economies to actually learn from one another, and money to support the efforts in emerging economies. Those three pieces are enormously important, and if you weave them together the way they were intended, there can be tremendous opportunities for leaps in terms of what is done. But I don't know anyone who succeeds in doing big policies for any country or state or local community without having a solid base of support for that. And that's what we've not focused on building, because we don't communicate clearly. We don't engage at the grassroots level, and I think we need to.
Related to the distributional aspect to some extent, the most popular question currently is, what do each of you think are the most important objectives for use of Green Climate Fund and other such funds in low-income developing countries? That's a broad question, of course, but important one. So would you like to start?
I think that one thing that is really important is to provide modern energy, access to modern energy to people who don't have it. And I think that the biggest thing here would be electrification that actually reaches everybody. That's really important, and that needs foreign aid in lots and lots of countries if that's going to happen anytime soon. And it should be done in a way that doesn't build in a whole lot of fossil fuel emitting infrastructure. So we really don't want to be building tons of coal plants. We want to be building emission-free alternatives.
I think education, very, very important. I think probably the most important part for our fund to use.
Interesting. Not always seen as a climate policy, but of course it is to some extent. Yeah. Okay, so I take the limit of the split here in the top of 15 each. I take the second one on the screen. Agriculture is a significant greenhouse gas source. In your opinion, when will we see the end of agriculture exceptionalism regarding the applications of the polluter-paying principle, basically? That's of course, is that something you would like to say something about, perhaps?
Well, I don't know whether I like to answer it, but we are currently reviewing the Common Agricultural Policy and the greening and the climate dimension inserting into that. Now, we built up, for the first time, a framework for land use change and forestry emissions, which was the uncovered pillar in the EU. Was a lot of new constituencies that needed to be convinced, but fully in agreement, agriculture, forestry, and what kind of carbon is stored into the soil is a very important issue for Europe, but for the rest of the world at large.
Could I just add, I think this is a difficult question to really get your arms around, because I don't know any country that really has effectively done agriculture policy, if you will. But I do think that there is a moment in time today that didn't exist before for people looking at what is a nutritious diet and what does a nutritious diet look like in a low-carbon future. And there's a lot of young people who are not committed to the same system and thinking and taste that folks my age seem to have committed to, and for good reason. And I think there is an opportunity, but it is going to be, I think, one of the most difficult challenges and long-term challenges we face, because it's very much culturally specific. It, in many ways, has religious overtones to it. And we're going to have to work on how we address this issue more effectively. But agriculture is, in the United States, it's the sector that is the highest, where there is the highest suicide rate of any sector. There are challenges that are facing the agriculture community because of existing climate impacts. And it's one of the main reasons why the countries are seeing migrations and are being very challenged by that. And we have to get around this issue. People need food and water, and we're not maintaining those fundamental core needs in many places, and climate change is directly impacting that.
Thank you. The current number one on the list here is a question that many non-economists often ask economists. I think they're mostly economists here, so it's interesting that economists ask ourselves those questions. Also, do you think that there are limits to market-based policies, in particular marginal pricing, when transitional changes, I guess that means sort of substantial changes in some sense, are needed? Do we need something else, or and so forth? Anyone? Ross?
Well, we have wide experience with carbon markets in the EU, and of course, the carbon market alone is unable to deliver what it is supposed to deliver, perhaps in the long term, but certainly not in the short and in the medium term. So you have to complement that carbon market with other ad hoc policies. For example, I take only one, which is a nightmare everywhere in Europe, is mobility and the use of the private car. If you have a carbon market, it's not going to get people out of their cars. You need a lot of other accompanying policies, and one can walk together with the other, but it's a fiction that sometimes European economic theoretical models have, as if one carbon market price is going to do the trick. I haven't seen it so far, but having said that, the carbon market is, in the EU's experience, damn important. You know, it has delivered the big chunk of our emission reductions and is planned to do that in the future. But you should not turn a blind eye to other promising policies that drive other behavior and other technologies into the market, such as renewables, as we agreed, as another important example.
I don't think, if I may just comment, I don't think that anybody will disagree among economists anyway that a carbon price or a GHG price by itself is enough. It's not, because we don't live in a world in which all the other markets are complete, and we don't live in a narrow to broad world. We live in the real world, and in the real world, all kinds of things are missing. So, in particular, we need public investment in research and development and in deployment as well, because capital markets are not going to deliver that on their own.
So in order to rephrase the question a little bit then, is there too much focus on market-based policy instruments among economists, or do we focus too much on that, or is it, alternatively, you may think that the prices are wrong. I mean, we do not manage to reduce the number of permits sufficiently in the European Union, we do not manage to get the prices up sufficiently when we use carbon pricing, and it's hard to implement carbon pricing and so forth, but should we focus broader than we currently do as economists?
Yeah, I think that we should. I think we do overemphasize carbon pricing. I think, let's put it this way, no one else is going to speak up for carbon pricing, so we better do it. But that said, I think that it is counterproductive to emphasize it to such a degree that we forget about other things that are very important and that are perhaps more feasible.
I agree.
Okay. So we end by that complete agreement, basically. Give me a big hand for the panelists. And,
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you all for contributing to these very good questions and so forth. So I will give you some symbolic gift, and most welcome back tomorrow morning for another exciting day. So please, a big hand again for this panel.